Um, and it's helpful if unions also, and union leadership follows it. I'm gonna have to take these safety glasses off so I can see my notes. So the second principle is the importance of proper technique, and I'll talk about that a little more in a few seconds. But the safety equipment only works if it's done the right way, if it's done the right way every time. And in order to do that, whoever is teaching other employees how to follow that technique has to be able to communicate it effectively. So when you can communicate a technique visually, where it's brief, or maybe you're saying words at the same time that there's a visual demonstration, that can be a much more effective way of communicating rather than putting out a 17-page policy that most people aren't going to read. And the fourth principle is when you are conveying the message about the safety technique or procedure, it has to be a clear and consistent message that is demonstrated. So in terms of leading by example, again, there is an ongoing problem in every plant, industrial plant, or in mechanical shops, in public works departments, for example, of getting employees to wear safety glasses. Should they wear safety glasses? Absolutely. Does it increase the likelihood they're going to go home every day with two eyes that work and not damaged? Yes. So how do you do that? Everyone at top management has to put their safety glasses on. It has to become a habit whenever they go into the shop. They need to tell employees, constantly remind them to wear them. It is very, very helpful if the union's leadership, both the staff representatives and the local stewards, also embrace the safety techniques and follow them and encourage people to follow them. Top management isn't always there, and a lot of times safety gets policed by coworkers in different ways of either ribbing or, hey, just put it on, or rookie, put the glasses on, or just by seeing other people doing it. People that are respected as leaders, if they're doing it, other people are more likely to follow it. It's very old-fashioned, but good organizations have safety committees that meet on a regular basis, not just to have a meeting, but they have real topics and to float ideas, to raise concerns, and try and treat it as a problem-solving process. Now, I should have done this at the very beginning, but I'm going to take my temperature. Yesterday, I was told before I got in it was 94.7. I said, that's great, I'm dead. But again, this is another example of leading by example, that everyone before they get in the door has their temperature taken and they get asked the forced questions, which, after a day or two become very routine, but you're sending a message that this is a real problem. We're concerned about it. We're trying to address it, and we're trying to keep everyone safe. I want to give a shout out to 3 organizations I've been in recently. So in Frenchtown Township, their Township Hall. In Allen Park, their City Hall. In Federal Screw Works, their plant in Romulus. You only can now go in one door, which I think is great from a security point of view. And before you go 5 steps, someone is stopping you and they take your temperature, they tell you your temperature, they ask you the 4 magic questions. If you fail, you go home. But it's reinforcing the overall message that this is a problem. In Frenchtown Township, they had a board meeting. I thought this was a wonderful example of leadership by example. The township board, they spread out, they used the entire room. Only 4 of the board members sat at the far part, I suspect they had measured it, at the main board table. The other 3 board members sat in the back of the room, again, spread out. The department heads that were in the room were spread out in the middle. There were very few chairs. There were enough for people there, but they didn't have extra chairs and they had eliminated them so people couldn't sit next to them. Everyone in that room, the township supervisor, all the department heads, all the other board members were either wearing masks or visors. Everybody could hear each other. You know, everybody was able to talk and present, but they're keeping each other safe. When I went into the plant in Federal Screw Works, which is sort of a typical size industrial open area, most of it's open area, there's some offices, but it hit me that if one person comes in to that plant infected, whether it's an employee or a visitor, they could take down by spreading the virus to virtually every person that works there. And as much as they want to clean it, there's so many touch points, it'd be almost impossible unless you brought a fumigator in every day. It'd be impossible to disinfect everything. Now let me go back to the point about the good techniques. So now that stores have reopened, we're starting to see a new fashion demonstration of people wearing masks. And so it's obvious that the mask is supposed to cover the nose and the mouth because that's where people spread their disinfectant, their aerosols, their virus. So every one of you have gone into a store recently and you have seen a clerk wearing a mask like this. That's really stupid, okay? It's really stupid. What is the point of that? But all of you have also seen, walking around stores and other places, people wearing a mask on their chin. Now, I get having it draped around your neck when you're in your car by yourself, so it's there before you can easily put it on and you don't forget. But there is no point in having a mask below your nose. There's certainly absolutely no point below your mouth other than convey that I really don't care about anyone else. And if I get 35 people sick and 2 of them die, tough, I'm comfortable, okay? So technique really matters. What I have learned by watching videos that you take your mask off from the back because the contaminants that you're breathing in are coming from the front, so you don't touch the front of your mask. And that's not a difficult message to convey. So people don't like masks because they're hard to breathe. So what I learned the other day from Tanya Whiting and Alan Park is these kind of N3 masks that are a little lighter than cloth masks. If you take the loop, stretch it out a little bit, turn it around, put it over your ears, you then have some venting on the side so your glasses don't fog up as much, and it's a little more comfortable to breathe. So this is not a safety demonstration. I'm trying to demonstrate the points that of leadership by example in sharing information. So with the masks, I try to point out 3 other principles related to safety. The first being, I missed one. So my mother was a registered nurse. My father was an obstetrician gynecologist. They never taught me how to wash my hands properly. And my father obviously knew how to do that because he was doing surgeries during the deliveries. So I learned in March by watching my boy Sanjay Gupta, a U of M graduate, on how to wash your hands. So what you need to do is make sure you hit all parts of the top of your hands and you hit your thumbs. He says thumbs are very important. I've never, ever, ever consciously thought before about washing my hands. Interlacing your fingers, which I would say 98% of my life, a problem in every word, and trying to get into your fingernails. And you want to do it for 20 seconds. Well, I count to 30.
Yeah,
Right.
it went pretty good. I'm
Hi, Linda. So what I'm trying to demonstrate with the washing of the hands, and I saw that on a CNN video, and the masks is three other principles of safety. So the first is that old techniques, things that people have been doing. So I've obviously been washing my hands for my 29 years of my life, but I've been doing it wrong or ineffectively, at least to eliminate basic germs and viruses and flu bacteria. Second principle is that safety is learned from other people. So it can be learned from experts, whether they are doctors or they are professors or people who have been doing it for a long time and doing it properly. Maybe the Myosha CET people. Um, it can be learned from management who's already done this and has studied it and researched it and tries to pass on the information. But it can be learned by other employees. So in my first job before in the city of Birmingham, before I was going to the barber to have gray and white dye put into my hair, um, I was assigned to represent the manager's office in the safety committee. And I remember probably close to 35, 40 years ago, two anecdotes that I learned from that. So the fire department would frequently wash their trucks, and guys would step off the little step of the fire department, and the floor would be wet, and they would slip, and they would turn their ankle, sprain their ankle, and we'd have lost time. And one of the employees from the DPW, one of the representatives, a laborer, said, well, why don't you paint the floor with non-slip paint? That's what we do in our mechanics area. And the fire lieutenant grumbled, they did that. We never had that type of injury again. In the Birmingham City Hall, at the time, there was no elevator. So you had to walk up a lot of steps on terrazzo floors. And this was a time in the 70s and 80s when women would wear, thick heels, spike heels or clunky heels. So on the slippery terrazzo floors, particularly in the wintertime, women were constantly, whether they were employees or citizens, slipping on the slippery terrazzo. And one of the employees, again, it was a DPW employee, and he said, why don't you put on non-slip strips? They're like rubberized strips. They have sort of a abrasive surface. And that cost probably $10. We never had that problem again. It eliminated it. So that taught me that the safety ideas can come from anywhere. They can come from rank and file people. They can come from people who don't even work in the department, but they bring their own life experience. In terms of organizations should share information clearly with this virus and with, I don't know what number of executive orders we are on. We were up to at least 120. It's past that and it keeps changing. So there's a need for organizations to share information. Some of the examples I've given you, I've learned from them and I've passed on to others. So it's important to share information organization to organization. I'll give a shout out to the HR people in the downriver municipalities. During this crisis, they have a phone call every Tuesday morning where they talk about what they're doing, how they're bringing employees back, what challenges they're getting, things they're doing. So one city said, for not a lot of money, we can buy 1,000 pens. So when residents come up to a cashier to fill a form out, even though the cashier's behind plexiglass, the pen is a touch point. So we give them we tell them to keep the pen. So that got shared among the other cities downriver. To conclude, in terms of the labor management relationship, the safety relationship of whether a safety committee works, whether unions' concerns are heard by management, whether management is able to get union leadership to buy into what it's doing, that's sort of frequently a reflection on the overall labor relationship. If it's an adversarial, non-collaborative relationship overall, those same folks who don't like each other, can barely talk to each other, aren't going to be able to share safety ideas together. If, however, all the elements that make for a good labor relationship of trust and credibility, mutual respect, a willingness to listen, those types of things are very important in hearing employee concerns and then trying to come up with solutions. It works better if you can involve employees for their suggestions and collaborate with them to try and solve problems. Because in the two anecdotes I gave a minute ago, example, the employees frequently have the answers. It is very helpful if unions, both the staff reps and the local leadership, support safety initiatives. One of the worst examples I've seen, I have a public sector employer has a wonderful safety record. They go years without a workers' comp claim. They really stress safety, and they wanted their employees, years ago, they wanted their employees to wear yellow high-vis hats when they're out in the parking lot so that the vehicles that come in don't hit them. And everyone complied except one of the stewards, who always wears a ball cap anyways. He put his high-vis cap on top of the ball cap, sort of to mock it. I thought that it still bothers me years later. General managers moved past it, but I think that's sending the wrong message. When an employee is coming to management or raising a concern, or unions raising, I think in that situation, management should walk in that meeting with the expectation that the employees should be doing 75% of the talking. Let them raise their concerns, and some of the 25% management's talking should be to ask questions, to draw out the concerns, and get the person to really articulate what their fears are, what their problems are. If the ideas don't work and management's going to say no, I think it ought to explain why, and not just say we're not going to do that. Safety is an ongoing process. It's not a one-time demonstration. It is something that requires continual retraining and reinforcement. So you can hit the little raise your hand or send a chat, and Bob will read those questions, and we're now going to do a roundtable discussion. I've been thinking about this last day, so I'll raise for the participants whether they think it's appropriate for employers to encourage, not require, but encourage their employees not to go to a bar outside of work. We have watched in the last week as Texas and Florida, some other states, in Lansing, we had a bar where there's now 32 young people have been infected by going to one bar in the course of a week. So again, going back to my plant example, in a fairly small organization, one person could come in and infect most of the workforce. So I'll throw that out for discussion, or any other questions or comments you have.
So before we go to the discussion and Q&A, would you all please join me in thanking Steve?
Thank you. Thank you.
General comment, Steve. One thing I found very helpful about your presentation is your message that being a role model, leaders need to be a role model in what they do, is so important. I'm going to start off with the first question, and like Steve mentioned, we will be monitoring the chat. You can all now take your mute buttons off if you have a question, and you can also react to any aspect of our discussion with a thumbs up or a hand signal to let us know that you might have a question. So let me start off first. In the area of safety and health, there's oftentimes a reluctance by employees to follow safety protocols. Prior to COVID, it might be wearing your ear protection or wearing your eye protection. The question I have for Steve and the panel is, one, how are you handling employee reluctance as a management issue or even an issue with a union? And secondly, for the mediators and arbitrators and neutrals on the call, what is the standard you're using to judge a possible discipline or discharge where an employee has been reluctant or resistant to following safety protocols?
So let me start out. So getting people to wear hard hats, whether they're in construction or certain types of indoor where there's cranes or heavy equipment moving, that's the constant problem. Ear protection, safety glasses. It is always, it's an ongoing problem. So I think you have to do the things I talked about by leading by example. I think frequently the unions can be helpful and say, look, you're potentially not only hurting yourself, then you'd hurt your family, but other employees, depending on what it is, you're putting the company at risk because my OSHA doesn't care whether you have a rule that says you have to wear ear protection or safety glasses. Company gets fined if the inspector comes in and people aren't wearing them. It's a problem that never goes away. I think discipline ought to be sort of a last resort, but after, a few talkings, then maybe you start progressive discipline. I would think arbitrators generally would follow the rule of obey now, grieve later, but I'll be interested in how other people view this.
While we're waiting for comments, I want to let everybody know that in the chat, I've put Steve's contact information, his name, email address, and phone number if this conversation wants to be continued after this. And virtually the entire session has been recorded, so you can catch this on the LERA website, and please feel free to share it with your colleagues.
So in preparing for this, I wrote an article which I'm submitting to the State Bar Labor section, probably come out in the fall. And if anybody wants a copy of that, because I'm so fascinating, or you want to pass on some of these things to somebody else in your organization, either call me or email me and I'll be happy to send that to you.
I have a comment, and then I also have a question. This is Alberta from Federal Mediation. What we've been experiencing, and I think my colleague Larry Sadrowski has probably run into the same thing. A lot of the contracts that are being negotiated right now, they're trying to put in articles or language pertaining to the pandemic or dealing with COVID and making sure that the employees get the proper training from the employers. And I heard some very good, I haven't had any grievances regarding discipline on things like employees not conforming or abiding by the workplace rules that have been in place since COVID-19 hit. But what a lot of the unions are trying to do is to get labor management committees or safety committees up and rolling. And some of the things that you spoke about, Steve, gave me some good ideas to get them to work together where both sides can kind of come together and put it out there. This is what we're doing in our workplaces, and then it spreads, because we know I have family members that work in the plants. I have family members that work in the grocery stores. I have family members that work at the hospitals and the nursing homes. So once we see what they're doing in their workplaces to be safe and to promote safety and proper ways of removing the gloves and masks and things of that nature, I think that will help spread to everyone else in the general public on these safety procedures so that we can all be safe. So I thank you for your comments and for your training on how to take off the gloves the right way today, and to wear my mask above my nose. So I'm guilty of that, especially when I'm abiding by the one-way aisles at the Kroger. So we'll get there. But personally, I haven't had any grievances yet on disciplines of employees in the workplace.
So if a union, one of my clients came to me and said the union wants to have training on the virus, I would say, jump on that and help them consider having the union help plan the training, the curriculum. One thing I've been thinking about, I didn't want to, I thought it could take up the whole time, but whether there's a duty to bargain over safety, I would think that the board would probably say yes in most cases. You know, there's classic Michigan Supreme Court and Merck cases that safety, for example, in Manning, if you raise a safety issue in the police or fire department, that's a mandatory subject to bargaining. However, perhaps in a management rights clause, you know, the right of an employer to select equipment or procedures, possibly that's already been bargained over. Merck came out with 2 decisions involving City Bay City, where Merck came up with read pretty general management rights clause that the employer already had the right to select equipment. Those weren't necessarily pure safety questions. The second case involved installing cameras inside sanitation trucks, but you know, there's probably a duty to bargain. There may be some core entrepreneurial decisions that either the board or Merck would say that it's really left up to the employer. But I think in a subject like this, if somebody wants to talk to you, sit down and talk to them and listen and see what they have to say.
Steve, I want to follow up and piggyback on your comment regarding away from work conduct. We're getting into the heart of summer, multi-generations in a typical workplace. People are going to be out and about, might as well say partying. You've got Jobby Nooner coming up here this Friday on Gull Island. You're going to have people doing things away from the workplace that others aren't going to be aware of. How are you going to handle that? How's an employer or employees going to handle exposure to possible problems, and how do you deal with that?
So with respect to the virus and probably most safety issues, there's individual responsibility, but there's also collective responsibility. The problem with the virus is not everyone is buying into this as a problem. You have people that appear to be reasonably intelligent people saying, I can't get it. I don't know why they think that. I don't know how many people have to get infected for the message. You know, we've had 2 million Americans get infected. We've lost 2.5 times the number of people we lost in the Vietnam War. But we see with this bar in Lansing that young people will go to a bar. I don't know why anybody has to go to a bar, why they can't sit in their backyard and drink a beer with their friends. So my family, I'm not allowed into my kids' houses. We sit outside in the backyard, spread out, and we're together as a family. You know, and you can't drink too much beer because they won't let us in the house. But I think it's appropriate, and I think maybe for an employer before Jobby Nooner, which I can't believe they're still doing, or you know, as the summer heats up, 4th of July,
Yeah.
have a meeting, maybe talk to the union leadership ahead of time and say, look, what you do outside of work, we're not policing that. We can't police that. There isn't a rule. But what you're doing potentially jeopardizes yourself, your grandparents, and everybody in this room. So let's go back over some of the basics and talk about what you can do. Wash your hands a lot. Wear the mask, wear the mud, stay 6 feet away. If you're lining up to, we'd ask you not to go to a bar. You know, people after three drinks are not going to be worried about, am I 6 feet away from someone? I think you have that discussion. I think you try, and then, you know, the protocols with the temperature and the questions will help a little bit, but there's a reason why we're seeing a spike this week. But and so if unions would join, I think that's great. And if the UAW and other unions join in, you know, the UAW appropriately was very concerned when the auto plants were going to reopen and whether they were opening too early. You know, we have this balance between economics and safety, but they go together. The organization is not going to do very well financially if half the workforce is out, you know, with COVID.
You know, one of the points that Larry brought up, and I think it's really an important point regarding off-duty misconduct. I did a survey of some of our clients. We had about 16 people, executives weigh in. And when the question came up as to how they were going to make sure their safety protocols were followed, almost all of them said coaching and counseling training, but there were a few that said they were going to implement zero tolerance and they were going to use discipline and discharge. And some of those were unionized, some of them were not unionized, but there are arbitral standards for discipline based on off-duty misconduct. And there is going to be an employer out there, maybe a unionized employer, that is going to say that somebody is going to be disciplined or discharged because they did something outside of the working hours. And I'm curious, in the same way I think Larry's curious, what is that standard and what is the best practice for contemplating how we're going to handle off-duty misconduct?
So as the general principle most arbitrators follow is, if the employer is going to discipline for off-duty misconduct, the employer has to show a nexus, which is a word no normal people ever use, a nexus between the off-duty misconduct and the employer's interest or the right to discipline under a just cause standard. So I would think one of the things you would have to convince an arbitrator is that the person contacted, got the virus, got infected off duty by going to a bar that they weren't required to do, as opposed to going to Kroger's to get food, or they got it from someone in the workforce who was at the workplace who was asymptomatic. That may be a difficult proof problem for an employer. You know, you'd have a lot of circumstantial evidence. The other thing that sort of immediately comes to mind is most arbitrators are of an age where they're in that vulnerable age group. So they may take this a little more personally, but I think if somehow the employer could show a nexus that they got infected by going to the bar in Lansing, and not at work, then an arbitrator might sustain it. But I think that's going to be a difficult proof problem.
Those arbitrators on the call, how do you think you would deal with the off-duty misconduct issue?
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead, Alberta.
If an employer is going to hold employees to off-duty conduct, wouldn't they have to first let them know or have a meeting or something, say to them, look, this is what we consider to be misconduct? Or because most employees, I don't know if they don't think about their employers ever dictating to them outside of the workplace conduct. So wouldn't they have to put them on notice first, or?
I think, I mean, Bob's question's a very challenging one. We could have an hour on this,
okay.
but I would
Another
say
meeting.
that an employer would have to give notice to the employees that we're holding you to this rule. I think the employer, and I think this would be difficult, a union would look, if it was fighting discipline, would look at, is there disparate treatment? Are you treating this one employee differently than the other? And where do you draw the line? Okay, you can go to Kroger because you need food, but you can't go to a bar. Well, can you sit outside in downtown Northville where the streets are closed to cars and eat at an outside restaurant? Can you go to get takeout food at a restaurant? Can you go to church in a very small, where there's only 10 people or 20 people and they're spread out? So I think as we talk about this gets more and more problematic to enforce.
So Steve, what I would add to that, when we've served our clients on off-duty misconduct, we've looked at three things. Aside from, is there notice? Is there a rule that people understand? Three things we've looked at, to Steve's point, the nexus is, one, was there off-duty misconduct that affects their ability to do the job? Two, is there off-duty misconduct that makes a coworker unlikely or undesirous to work near that person? And three, does the off-duty misconduct affect the reputation of the employer in the community? And as I've been thinking about this, the meatpacking industry is a wonderful example. So we know that if you have an infection and you're dealing with a food product, you can put that on the food product. We also know that many employees come to the workplace afraid that they will be infected. And so we hear a lot of complaints in the media about employees that are saying, I want more testing to know if I'm safe working next to another person that might be infected. And lastly, if one of these meat packing companies has been admitting people with a virus or a known virus or a high probability of virus, does that say to the meatpacking customers that their product is not safe? You know, it goes straight to the reputation of the company. And I think those are all legitimate things to be concerned about. But up until now, those off-duty issues that we've dealt with have been, you know, drunkenness or uncivil acts or drug use, something like that. I think today, the question I'm asking is, how do we take that standard and apply it to a completely novel situation?
So I think no one knows the answer yet because we haven't had cases. So I think arbitrators would go back on these principles. You know, the issue with the meat packing is really the opposite. They're getting the virus because they're in too close proximity, and assuming those reports are right, or the media reported it, that the meatpacking employers were not doing the safety protocols they should have done from the beginning, and then they're taking it out into the community. So they're not getting it at the bar, but they're spreading out. That's sort of the reverse. I wanted to mention another really good practice. The Northville Police Department, they were concerned, it's a small department. If one officer got infected, he would knock out the whole platoon. They don't have enough people to replace him. So there were two things they did that were really, I think, wonderful. One is Wayne State was doing testing, and they did mobile testing. They brought, they made testing available for police officers for both the broomstick up your nose test as well as the antibody test. Every officer took it. It helped that relationship. The other thing, because they had a good relationship between the union and the chief, Northville City, Northville Township agreed on an interim basis to combine their operations so they would have enough people to adequately staff. But I think it's going to be difficult for an employer to sustain, and more we talk about it, to sustain discipline off duty. I don't think it's impossible, but you'd have to show all these elements that Bob talked about and Larry talked about, Ms. Brigsby talked about.
Go ahead, Larry.
I don't want to belabor this, but there was a good point mentioned about generational bias in looking at this. Again, looking at the screen and telling by our hairdos, we got a definite differences as far as age groups that are here. But conduct, how would you define conduct as being so egregious or flagrantly outside the lines of things happening outside the workplace, and then individuals bringing themselves back into the workplace and possibly exposing large numbers of people in the workplace? Now, I guess that would be a concern that an employer would have, or going back to what you said about the nexus of other employees not wanting to work with someone who, does that kind of behavior. What do you do?
So I think there are probably a bar. I think it's much easier to make an argument, a convincing argument. Going to a bar is egregious conduct. And if there were video of people standing in line and they're next to each other, as opposed to somebody who goes to a mega church and there's a couple hundred people, even if they're sort of spread out, but they're indoor, is it indoors versus outdoors? But again, I think the solution to this is not so much discipline as it is education. I don't think anybody has figured out how to get millennials, and I'm stereotyping millennials, but it appears generationally millennials are not getting this message. In the most recent statistics, the spike we've had this week are a very large proportion are millennials, and the people in their 20s, much less so people in their 50s or 60s. There's a generational difference. So maybe what we need to do is get millennials who have bought into this be the messenger. Maybe what we need to do is get celebrities. I mean, obviously none of us are affecting this, but we need to get celebrities that are role models to young people. This is a tough problem,
So Steve, we have one question on the chat from Dave Bomser. And in it, he says, many states have laws related to off-duty conduct and monitoring, which relate to the topic. This is a question for you and the whole group. Where is Michigan on this?
Michigan has laws on taping phone calls, and I always have to look it up. I can't remember who, I think the person who records the phone call. I don't know that there are laws preventing government from using drones or surveillance. There's certainly board law on filming strikers on a public sidewalk, but I don't think Michigan has a whole lot. I can't off the top of my head in terms of statutes or case laws that really directly affect it. I think in a labor environment, the off-duty conduct is really regulated. It's the wrong word, but I think it's really through the grievance and arbitration process, and that going back to Bob's original question. But in terms of laws, other than the governor's executive orders, which I think are still, we don't know whether they're going to be upheld or not. We're still in that litigation process. I don't think there is an awful lot.
Okay, so we're in the last minute. If there is one last short question, either type it into your chat or just unmute and ask it. Okay, having seen no other questions in the chat or people typing up, I want to thank Steve Schwartz, our former past president and really wonderful contributor. Once again, let's thank Steve and hope to have something like this again in the future. Have a wonderful summer, everybody.
All right, thank you.
Thank
You
you.
too.
Yeah.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Good job, Steve.
Thank you. This
Thank
was
you.
fun to do. It's an interesting conversation.